Hello, BookTube. Well, this Sunday morning, I went out once again for the New York Sunday Times. That started out as kind of a indulgence of nostalgia because I used to do that every week, and wondered when I discovered that a shop nearby had the New York Sunday Times, I wondered what it would feel like to do it again in the age of online hypersaturation of facts and factoids and alternative facts and whatnot. And I thought it would be temporary because it was just an indulgence in nostalgia, but it turns out I love it. I'm sorry that I didn't do it all along. It's not just the wonderful tangible feel of rummaging through this. The New York Sunday Times is an amazing production. Again, as I've said, regardless of your political affiliation, it's just an amazing thing to think that this much work gets compiled every week and costs $6. But it's not just that. It's also that, well, first of all, the peripherals, which I had completely forgotten. For instance, developing a friendly bantering relationship with the guy who sells the paper. But also something that's exclusively the 21st century, something that I could not have anticipated. Something that, in fact, I would have anticipated just the opposite. If you'd told me, well, you're going to live to see a time when there's a 24-hour news cycle and the ability to receive updates from news organizations, amateur news people, rumor mongers, the government, is instantaneous, thanks to a playing card-sized thing in your pocket. I would have said, okay, well, if that's true, and you're talking images and video and text with corrections and updates in real time, if you're telling me that that's what's going to happen, then then the print media can't hold a candle to that. I will certainly prefer that to the New York Sunday Times, and that is not true. That has turned out not to be true. I had a friend of mine mention to me a month ago or so that curating your news intake is really crucial to your mental health. Not creating a bubble for yourself. Not that. By curating, I don't mean reinforcing your own ideas. I mean stopping the bombardment. The bombardment is designed to engage your ugliest emotions, and it's very bad for you. It's very, very bad for you. It rips away at the heart, at the lining of your arterial walls. I have found that reading the New York Sunday Times from front to back in great detail every week has very much calmed and lessened my curiosity about that ongoing stream. That ongoing stream is essential for breaking news. If I want to know the very latest information from people on the ground about a massive earthquake, or for instance, the thing that alerted me to this potential, the Boston Marathon bombing, well, then you need social media for that, because you're not going to get updates from legacy media for a while. You just have to keep in mind that most of the updates you get from social media will be wrong. So I think I've very much added this. As long as that shop continues to go in business and continues to sell the Times, I think I will just keep going there. I don't know how that resolve will hold up in the middle of winter, but it's doing fine right now. And I had an extra motive this morning to get the Times, read it, and then drag you through every bloody word of it. That's that David Murphy did a walkthrough of the Wall Street Journal's weekend edition over on his channel. And it was 42 minutes of mind-numbing tedium. If he could do that, I can do that. Now, his walkthrough was fascinating, and he's just the person you want to lead you through the business arcana of the journal. I can't do any such thing. All I can do is bloviate about books. But we're not going to get to that for a bit. Because if he can walk you through sections of a paper, so can I. Of course, the Tootsie Roll center of the New York Times, the New York Sunday Times, is the book review. The New York Sunday Times book review is a pull-out standalone edition of a type that most major newspapers used to have. Most famous one, other than the Times, would have been the Book World, the Washington Post Book World. Most major newspapers have folded, first of all. The ones who remain, most of them can't afford to do that sort of thing anymore. Their demographics have shown them that there isn't that much interest in books, or whatever the reason is. But we'll save that for last. We'll start with the front section of the paper. I don't know if it's the way my shop guy assembled the paper this morning. He assembles them at dawn, long before I get there. I don't know if it's the way he assembled it this time around or not, but my New York Sunday Times this week was mercifully free of news. So there was no, as far as I could see, there was no national news section, there was no world news section. Basically, most of the news as such that I got was in the very front section. And of course, the front section of the paper above the fold, the most valuable real estate, is almost entirely given over to the immigrant concentration camps that the Trump administration has set up on the U.S. southern border. Many of them holding children who have been ripped away from their parents without any record keeping of how to get them back in touch with their parents. Their parents and themselves are now living separate lives, and the worst trauma that you can inflict on a kid has been inflicted on hundreds of these little kids. But the Trump administration has not been content with inflicting that drama. Instead, they've gone on to inflict more drama. As many commentators have pointed out, the cruelty is the point. So these children are denied toys, they're denied the ability to play, they don't have beds, they don't have caretakers, so that you have 6 and 7-year-olds taking care of 2 and 3-year-olds who aren't related to them and who they didn't know before yesterday. Horrific scenes, in other words. Children not allowed to bathe or brush their teeth. Rampant disease, of course. If you don't allow basic hygiene and sanitation, you'll have rampant disease. With people going down to the border, Congress people going down to the border, seeing these things, human rights watchers seeing these things, and yet nothing being done. Nothing being done. When, obviously, since this is all over the national news, since every American with even a twinge of a conscience is deeply ashamed of this, and also reassessing their previously harsh estimations of every German in 1930s Germany. Since all of that is true, that was a major story in David's Wall Street Journal as well. And as David put it, this could stop today. The administration could stop this today. It just doesn't. The cruelty is the point. And the thing that outraged me, I mean, I read every word of these stories in the paper. You can't not read it. And the thing that outraged me was the lack of condemnation. You have to go several sections back to the opinion section to get condemnation. The Times goes so far away from condemnation that they move into the territory of actual abetting. Like, for instance, this description right there, I don't know if you can make it out, but it says a jail-like setting. Not a jail. A jail-like setting. There's barbed wire and chain link. The people who are inside the barbed wire and chain link are not allowed to come and go as they please. And the basic necessities of their life, food, clothing, that sort of thing, medical care, are not only regulated by people they don't know and against their will, but punitively regulated. They get a small fraction of those things. That is a jail. Okay? At the very least, that is a jail. It moves into concentration camp territory if the people who are confined in this jail-like setting are denied any but the tiniest shred of the ability to live. If, in other words, their extermination as people, their death, is part of the program, then it stops being a jail. I know that description could apply to many jails all throughout the world, but that doesn't make it any less true here. And that jail-like setting irritated me enough, but then I read the main article above the fold, which is by, it's by Simon Romero, Zolan Cano-Youngs, Manny Fernandez, Daniel Barunda, Aaron Montez, and Caitlin Dickerson. I didn't think you'd fit that many people around a word processor. But it's set in Clint, Texas, where the worst of these hellholes is, where the worst of these concentration camps is. And the quote in the article that drove me crazy was a veteran border agent who has worked at the Clint station since it was built says, "It gets to a point where you start becoming a robot." He described following orders to take beds away from children to make more space in holding cells, part of daily routine that he said had become heartbreaking. Most of what I have to say in response to this person saying that his duties, his just following orders, are heartbreaking, I can't say on a family channel. But it is absolutely no excuse whatsoever. It isn't even a valid commentary to say that someone tells you to take a bed away from a frightened child and you do it because you feel like a robot. You're not a robot. Robots don't have feelings. We're told that after the jump, when you get to the rest of this article, that sometimes these agents have tears in their eyes. Big deal. That is the sanitary way of saying what I want to say. Big deal. You have tears in your eyes, while the pot-bellied, mustachioed middle manager comes into your break room and tells you, yeah, you two, when your break's over, you got to go out and take those toys away from those kids. I don't really care if you have tears in your eyes if your response to that command is, okay, for your hourly wage, for your benefits, so you don't have to bag groceries in order to put food on the table for your family. That's what we were talking about the other day. That's what I was talking about on this channel the other day, about character and how it isn't built by books and it isn't reflected by tweets. It's what you do when you are called upon to make a decision between right and wrong. What is your character? So I don't really care that these people have to make themselves feel like robots in order to do the unthinkable. What I care about is that they have bad characters. They can be made to do the unthinkable. They have bad characters. That drives me nuts. That drives me nuts. And I'm amazed that it isn't a firewall election issue. I'm amazed at the way that U.S. Executive politics have gone in the last 2 months has just amazed me. The Democratic leadership in the House of Representatives has all the information they need to impeach Donald Trump. And they have the moral imperative to do so, since all of these atrocities, these children being raped, these children dying of easily preventable diseases, these children crying all night long and banging their heads against cement, obviously being traumatized for life for a crime they didn't have anything to do with, this is all on Donald Trump. This is on him. I'm not even willing to stretch it to say his administration. These people know what he wants them to do. Cruelty is the point. So in addition to the fact that he obstructed justice a dozen times and is enriching himself by making a fool of himself and a criminal on the international stage, and also his relatives doing the same, as if that weren't bad enough, Congress now also has the moral high ground to impeach somebody who's guilty of international war crimes. And they won't do it. And this story is not the only thing that anyone in the country wants to talk about. I have actually had encounters with Trump supporters in the last week. 2 different people who don't know each other. And the subject of politics came up, and I said, probably we shouldn't talk about it. And both of them, in their own way, wanted to know. Both of them have known me for a while, and both of them, in their own way, asked, well, why shouldn't we talk about it? And there was a long pause, and then I said, because the Trump administration has constructed concentration camps for children on the southern border. That's why we shouldn't talk about it. And in both cases, each person immediately said, yeah, but the economy. So those of you who don't live in America and think maybe, I can't imagine that you do, but think maybe that the Americans are just indifferent or complacent about this, or complicit, I want you to know, this is ending friendships. This is ripping families apart. This is not a complacent issue. And I don't know those people anymore. If I can mention concentration camps for children, and you can acknowledge that those camps exist and acknowledge what's going on in them, and then immediately say, yeah, but the economy, then I don't know you anymore. And I never did. And that's hard. This has been very hard. I've said since 2016 that one of the hardest things about this dark period in American history isn't that these things are happening. That is bad. That is dark. But that this has shown you people that you thought you knew. This answers a call of some people for fascist cruelty that you didn't know they had. You wouldn't have known. There wouldn't have been any way for you to know. America's not going to be militarily conquered, so you're never going to get to see who collaborates with the conquerors. This is the way that we know, and it's a horrible awakening. It's been a horrible awakening. But below the fold, after you're done with concentration camps for children on American soil, and the people who run them saying, yeah, you have to make yourself feel like a robot, or you won't take away their toothbrushes. Below the fold, there's another story that has been much in the American mind in the last week, and that is the fact that 2 major earthquakes struck California. Not as major as they could be, although people were saying that, like, for instance, this article, which is by Tim Arango and Thomas Fuller, this article links the 2. One was 6.2, 6.4 on the Richter scale. One was 7.1. And the article links the two, that they're somehow vaguely connected. Basically, though, they're not. I mean, you could say that one is a pre-tremor for the other, or a post-tremor for the other. But if they take place days apart, or weeks apart, or as the article says, years apart, I consider them separate events. And the thing that you need to realize, the thing that doesn't come up until after this article jumps to the middle of the paper, where 90% of the readers don't follow it, the thing that you need to realize is that 7.1 is not just a few points worse than 6.4. It's orders of magnitude worse. And same thing with 7.5 or 7.8, God help us. The damage would be much, much more severe. And, of course, the geologists who are consulted for this article and every other article are impossibly vague. They don't know what's going to happen. Why you even talk to them? They have no more ability to predict what's going to happen or even lay odds than a Joe Schmo citizen on the street. My own prediction is that there are going to be a series of these quakes. Some worse, some better, but all fairly severe, all over 6 point on the Richter scale. And the point that I wanted to make about the article comes up right on the front page. Officials were urging residents to keep supplies handy: batteries, flashlights, a pair of sneakers, if they haven't already. Don't be paralyzed by fear. Josh Rubenstein, the spokesman for the Los Angeles Police Department, wrote on Twitter, "Arm yourself with knowledge and a plan. Talk about what you would do when the big one hits." I myself just did this with my daughter and my wife. And I wanted to point out, not just to Americans, but to anybody, that is a really good idea. And it's advice that most people don't even think about, much less follow. It doesn't have anything to do with earthquakes, although if you're in an earthquake-prone area, then it's an excellent idea. Well, really, it has to do with the world that we now live in, where I believe this series of quakes, all above 6, are going to continue on a fairly regular basis. I'd be willing to bet that if we reconvened in September, we'd be talking about 5 earthquakes, not 2, in California. God forbid that any one of them is the big one. The big one, I mean, if you had an 8 Richter scale, 8.0, 8.1 quake on the Richter scale in Southern California, the damage, the loss of life would be unbelievable. It would be off the charts. It terrifies me to think of a national emergency on such a scale happening with the Trump administration in office. It just terrifies me. They haven't staffed half the government. And their priority, if such a thing happened, would be to make sure to route federal relief funds to white people. Anyway, the point that I wanted to make is not just about these earthquakes. It's also about superstorms. It's about and it's about foreign hacking. We now know the intelligence agencies that Donald Trump ignores every day have now stated as a categorical fact that there are Russian operatives, probably state-sponsored, who have relatively free reign in the electronic control of the American electrical grid. And the only reason that they haven't crippled that grid is because we have likewise control, and so do a lot of other countries. There are bugs crawling around in your system right now and could take it down at a whim. We're not talking anymore about the day after, about nuclear catastrophe. We're talking about things that are much more likely to happen. So the point that I want to make, in terms of the electric grid being fried or going down, if the Russians can do it, then some bored kid can do it. But also in terms of natural disasters like an earthquake, or for instance, if you're on the United States eastern seacoast, if you're living below the Mason-Dixon line, then now is around the time when you're starting to think about hurricanes. This is hurricane season. The point of catastrophic climate change is that hurricane season is now open season for anybody on a seacoast. And the New England seacoast could easily get struck by a hurricane. The ocean will be warmer than it has ever been in recorded history, which means that there's plenty to feed a hurricane if it decides to go rogue and head north, instead of hugging the coast and going east, or west, rather. And if you're on the New England seacoast, or the eastern seaboard, from Pittsburgh to Maine, and you get struck by a Category 5 hurricane, this advice will apply to you as well. So the advice that I want to give you here is very simple. And it isn't very expensive because you have the luxury of doing it in installments. You should also have these supplies handy. Now, I would recommend a small portable gas-fed generator. That's the largest outlay of money. You want to buy a generator and a couple of containers of gas for it, and then just store it somewhere. In a closet, in a basement, somewhere you can get to. But even if you don't, that's elaborate. I'm talking, even if we're just talking basics, you want bottled water, and not the little plastic bottles. You want sealed gallon jugs of water. 2 gallons per person per day, figuring for 5 days. So you want a pallet of water. You want a couple of really good multi-purpose tools that have can openers, knives, that sort of thing. Don't just get one. Get a couple. Get a few. You want batteries, a big supply of batteries, and you want to make sure to protect them from the elements or keep renewing them. You want non-perishable food items for yourself and your kids and your pets. Figuring, you go online, do a quick search. What you want to do, what you want to lay in, is enough nutritional value to sustain your health without deterioration for 5 days. If you are anything like everybody that I know, I know people in all sorts of countries, at all levels of Western-style technology, from Kuala Lumpur all the way to New York City. If you're like the people that I know in those cities, you don't have any of that laid aside, and you never even think about it. Much less a plastic tarp to cover you should you lose shelter. Fire devices, a flashlight, should you use light or heat. A plan, should you be connected to other loved ones. You need all of that. You don't have to dwell on it. You don't have to be a prepper. But having none of it in 2019 is insane. It guarantees that you will be, I won't say that it guarantees you'll die, but you'll be making your life a living hell if something like this happens. And it has never been more likely to happen than now. So, water, 2 gallons per person per day. Non-perishable food items, knives, can openers, waterproof sealed matches, flashlights, a tarp, meds if you need them. If you need meds, make sure to stockpile them and keep them at the temperature that will keep them good. A radio that works, preferably the best radio that you can get, because the updates won't come on the internet. They won't come by phone. That won't be possible. Radio will be the way you will learn if there's, for instance, a drop-off point for water or food. Do you want to be relying on begging someone to use their radio or not having anyone nearby have one? Do you even have a working radio in your house? I don't want to stress it too much, but the main point I want to take from that story is that. Not prepping, but you really ought to build a small pallet, a small box of stuff that will allow you to live without the grid, without the electrical grid, perhaps in a destroyed or partially destroyed home for 5 days. That's all. 5 days. You should really think about it. But anyway, what else do we have here? David Murphy went on at just an incredible, tedious length. I want to do the same thing. What else do we have? Do we have anything else? Nobody that I know. I immediately checked the what friends of mine have called the Irish sweepstakes. I immediately checked the obituaries to see if anybody had dropped off the twig that I knew. Oh yes, the other story that I wanted to mention on the front page here is from Lake City, Florida, which was held hostage by a cyber terrorist who locked out all of their emails and all of their servers and all of their data, the town records going back 150 years, and demanded hundreds of thousands of dollars of ransom money. And they were encrypted, and they were skillful. The town couldn't find them. And the article goes on at great length and tells us that has happened in many towns and could be the wave of the future. Imagine that. Some towns are refusing to pay, and the towns that are paying in cryptocurrency or whatever, totally untraceable, are being chastised by the government and by other towns, saying, this just makes it worse. You're encouraging people when you pay them ransom. But anyway, we'll move on. We'll move on to the Sunday Review section, which has a front-page article about Nancy Pelosi, who is the Democratic leader not impeaching Donald Trump. That has become the first woman in history to become Speaker of the House of Representatives twice. And you would have thought that would be her footnote in history. But her footnote in history increasingly looks like she is the person who refused to impeach Donald Trump. Like, that will be the place that she goes down in history. And this is a long, loving profile by Maureen Dowd. I had to smile when David Murphy was going through the Wall Street Journal and rolled his eyes just a bit. He rolled his eyes about as much as you can roll your eyes in the Me Too generation at Peggy Noonan, at the just ossified, elephantine presence of Peggy Noonan after, I think she was writing during the temperance movement, and she's still doing the same Peggy Noonan unreadable nonsense. And I winced a little because my Sunday New York Times involves Maureen Dowd, which is the exact same thing. That facial expression was one of the funny moments in David Murphy's video. Not rivaled, of course, by the funniest moment in the video, which happens about the halfway point, if I remember correctly, when he says the immortal line, "I am not a Republican." I can't remember if that was before or after he just offhandedly advocated the abolition of, was it the FDA? Or the NDA? Or the TSO? Something like that. Maybe he advocated for abolishing all of them. Let the market sort it out. Yeah, but you're not a Republican. Okay. but this, if I remember correctly, this Sunday Review section also had something that wasn't about Nancy Pelosi. Do I remember that correctly? Oh God, it just goes on forever. It's Nancy Pelosi's parade. Oh yes, the other funny thing in this section was about France, where there's a long article about how some people in France have taken to caves to beat the heat. Apparently, the country's cooling stations, places that have air conditioning, were massively swamped by the recent heat wave. And a couple of people were advocating a natural solution, which is to retreat into the caves. There's some people here who live in caves. Apparently, caves are very climate sensible. They don't get overly cold and they don't get overly hot. There's even there's a lovely picture of someone's subterranean rumpus room. I don't know if you can make that out. And I was reading the article and I was thinking, okay, so the article's gist is that you beat the heat by going into a cave, going down into a cave where you don't have to worry about the outside temperature. And you know what my first thought was? I'd rather die of heat exposure. I really would rather do that than live in a cave. But I thought that was kind of funny. And then we have the next section was the Sunday Styles. And there was a lot in here, but the main thing that got my attention, the main thing that they gave real estate to, there's an article by John Herman and an article by Nellie Bowles, and both of them are about digital detox. The first one is panicked parents have begun hiring screen time consultants. And the other one, the other article, the one by John Herman, is the apps that we can't let go. So many of us have half-quit services like Instagram and Twitter. It's pure purgatory. And as you might guess, you've heard it on this channel many times before, both of these articles are entirely about people who absolutely refuse to exercise, say it with me now, self-control. They absolutely refuse to do it. In fact, the only angering part in these articles and all other discussions like this about digital detox and addictive apps is that these people who refuse, these pampered people who refuse to exercise even a little self-control, have started, they've long since been doing it, adopting the language of drug addiction, saying they're addicted to these apps. That is absolutely not true. That is absolutely not true. And the reason it angers me is because it demeans the real struggle with addiction that real addicts have. But the articles are full of tactics that these pampered people have taken. That, well, I have apps that shut down my other apps after a certain amount of time, or I remove apps like Instagram or Twitter from my phone. And the article by John Herman constantly switches to the passive tense whenever you follow up on that decision. So these people, these pampered people in the course of this article will talk about how, yeah, I got rid of Instagram and Twitter from my phone. And then Herman's narration will have it that, but sooner or later, those apps were back. Like they just downloaded themselves. Well, no, these pampered people keep downloading them again. And it's not a question of downloading them. It's a question of whether or not you use them responsibly. That's all. It's just a question of self-control. That's all. But that was a huge section of this 2 whole articles on one is hiring digital consultants to detox you and your kids. And one of the suggestions is, why don't you play ball? And the other was for normal adults. What do normal adults do if their apps are taking over their life? And then the last section before we get to the book review was the arts and leisure section. There wasn't anything really to look at here, except that every time I look at this section, I just think, okay, well, this is a section devoted to full-page color ads for all of the Broadway shows that Juan of Just One Reader and I are going to see together someday. Someday that is going to happen. And then the New York Times Magazine, the glossy magazine that comes with the paper, last time had a creepy article about the children of artificial insemination who go out and find all the other children that came of that same sperm donor and insist on calling themselves siblings and hunting each other down and finding out about each other's lives. And underneath the writing and the interesting stories of those young people, I just found the whole concept creepy, just really creepy for some reason. And not to be outdone, New York Times Magazine this week had an even creepier article about scientists who are engaged in a campaign to reignite dead pig brains. Yeah, you heard that correctly. They want to reignite the neurons of dead pig brains. To take a pickled pig brain out of its preservation fluid and work to reignite its neurons. The neurologists in the article say that in terms of biology, in terms of neurology, in terms of electrochemical combinations, there isn't any really good reason why this organ has to stop working. And of course, the extrapolation of the whole article is that if a pig's brain doesn't have to stop working, then a human's brain doesn't have to stop working. But in order to get to that implication, you have to go through the creep factor again. But eventually, we get to the book review. The Tootsie Roll Center of the New York Sunday Times. And the book review this time around has an incomprehensible cover. I have no idea what that means. It's just a bunch of tiles with symbols on them. But the review itself, we go, you look at the full-page ads. There's still a full-page ad for the paperback release of Dave Itzkoff's biography of Robin Williams. A full-page color, two-tone ad for that. No idea why you would do that for a paperback release. And once again, there is still a half-page ad for Peter Baker's book on President Obama. I don't really know why that is. I don't know why that keeps going. I guess if I had to guess, I would say that the publishers think, well, the way you're going to hit the mother lode of people who are nostalgic for Barack Obama is the New York Times, and that is quintupled if you want people who will read a book about him. So you want a color ad just every week in the New York Times book review. I guess that might make sense. If I were those people, I would feel a little manipulated. But we move straight on to the letters page. And when I go to the letters page, I always look for controversies to see who's up in arms about what. And I was a bit surprised. I mentioned last week Jill Lepore, the historian Jill Lepore, did a long roundup article on many, many Apollo 11 books for the anniversary in 2019. And I thought the article was okay. I was mainly looking at it from a workman-like position, because I've had to do roundup articles like that before myself, and it's really hard to do. It's really hard to do justice to any of the books if you've got 8 of them. Even if you've got a generous amount of space, there's only so much you can do with every one of them. And so I was watching on a technical level to see what Jill Lepore decided to do with that challenge and what she didn't. And I think that maybe made me a little less attentive to some of the nuances in her article, because people wrote in about... apparently, at some points in her article, she bangs the drum for the sexism, not only of the Apollo 11 mission and the NASA space program just in general, but also of a lot of the books covering it. And one of the authors writes in a letter to push back against that. But there was also a point that she makes that got a really interesting short letter. This is from Barry Bass in Baltimore, who writes, in her essay marking the half-century since Neil Armstrong first stepped on the moon, Jill Lepore repeated the phrase, "one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," that he was purported to have spoken. Armstrong insisted throughout his life that he actually said one small step for a man, and that the tape recording had failed to pick up that one crucial word. It seems only right that the person who spoke those famous words should be the final arbiter of what was actually said. I thought that was interesting. Of course, there's another possibility. There's one other possibility, which is that Neil Armstrong, all the way to the moon, said, what I'm going to say when I step off the ladder onto an alien world is, this is one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. And then when he got to the bottom of the ladder and was one instant away from being the first human to step on the soil of another world, maybe he was a little nervous. Maybe he flubbed his line. It's possible. I've heard that recording a million times. I don't hear a space where a letter would be. But there's the by the book section where the Times talks to some new literary person one way or another. This time, literary person is stretched to the breaking point because they talk with Bud Selig, former baseball commissioner, who has a book out, and that's why they're doing it, because it's part of that deal. But I gotta confess, I didn't get a whole lot of an impression in that article of a literary person any more than I got that impression in his book. But then there's a big feature in the middle, which is the best 50 memoirs of the past 50 years. I almost think that the front, the gibberish on the front, has something to do with that. The gibberish on the front looks like a computer code. I don't know why you would do that, though, in connection with 50 memoirs, so maybe not. But it's the New York Times' staff book critics, Dwight Garner, Parul Sehgal, and Jennifer Salai, select the most outstanding memoirs published since 1969. And it was really interesting to look through here. It was really interesting to see what some of the things that get mentioned and some of the ones that don't. I myself think that 50 is an unworkably large number. I don't think that any one of those three people could, for instance, name 50 memoirs on their own. Not even Dwight Garner. If you sat him down with a pad of paper and a pencil, I don't think he could write 50 memoirs out on a page. And if he can't do that, then saying 50 best means just literally anything that the three of you can come up with when you're spitballing. But there were a lot of interesting things in here. Liar's Club by Mary Carr was in here, which is garbage. But and there was quite a bit of garbage here. But Palimpsest by Gore Vidal was in here, and also Barack Obama's Dreams from My Father was in here. But there was one other that struck me. One other that I wasn't expecting it, and boy oh boy do I say that. Yes, Barbarian Days by William Finnegan. That was it's not credited. The front few in this feature are credited as to who picked them up. Pretty sure it was Dwight Garner that picked that one. But that was a terrific memoir. But anyway, that's all that feature was. It's just 51 paragraph descriptions of memoirs. Then we move on to the book review itself. There are good things and bad things about it, as always. There's a long article about Fall by Neil Stephenson, his latest doorstopper of a book. It's by Charles Yu, and let me see here. There was one point that bothered me. Somewhere in this 900-page book is a 600-page book. That is very true, and that's a very good line. One has the same story, but weighs less. Without those 300 pages, though, it wouldn't be Neil Stephenson. It's not possible to separate the essential from the decorative. It most certainly is, but nor would we want that, even if it were. Not only do his fans not mind the extra, it's what we came for. That's in the third paragraph of this review, that Charles Yu notes that the book is 300 pages too long and says he doesn't care because he's a fan of the author. I would have thought that the editorial board of the New York Times Book Review, when they're looking over that, would have said, okay, well, that needs to go, or if you insist on that being there, then it turns out you're not qualified to review this book. Because that's what it is. That is a confession that he is going to overlook any kind of shortcoming because he's a fan of the author. And that bugged me. It bugged me not only that it would be true, I would suspect it of almost anyone who reviewed that Neil Stephenson book, but that it could be admitted and not change anything. Talk about taking it with a grain of salt. I'm really hoping that people do when they read it. But there was a highlight as well. There was an essay. Mary Norris writes an essay, "What Makes Reading About an Author's Obsessions a Thrill and Not a Bore?" Nothing does, but she says there is something. She says she makes a case for it, and does so in the most annoying way. Herman Melville not only harnessed his obsession with the sea in his early books Typee, Omoo, and White Jacket, all set aboard ship or on remote islands, but managed to make obsession itself his subject in Moby Dick, a book I'm not alone in being obsessed with. There's so much wrong with that sentence. I don't even know where to start. That an obsession with the sea was not the genesis of those first 3 books, and a book about obsession is not quite the same thing as an author writing about his obsessions. Now, is it? But there was. I know that I don't. I know that that there was a high point in here. What was it? I think I might have missed it. There was. Oh no! I did miss it. It wasn't in the book review. That was basically it for the book review. There's a page devoted to YA books. There is an advertisement. The back page is an advertisement for that illustrated von Humboldt graphic novel that we saw. That's all it is. I don't know what it's doing there. Just maybe to alert readers that it's there. But earlier, elsewhere in the Times, I missed it. I think it was in the Arts and Leisure section. Susan Jacoby, who's an author that I praised on this channel before, writes a piece about, in response to the right wing and the alt-right's call for religion, i.e. Christianity, i.e. misogyny, to be reintroduced to the American public square. The reason that we're in such a hyper-partisan and divided era is because we no longer have the glue of Christianity holding us together. I've seen at least two, high-profile YouTube atheists, career atheists, people who made a channel out of being atheists, recently make long and incredibly deceptive videos about how they think that it's barren and they're going back to believing in God, as if that were even possible. And that kind of attitude that we need to go back to re-embracing Judeo-Christian values. Little tip here, a little pro tip for you. Whenever anyone says they want to go back to embracing Judeo-Christian values, it means they want to subjugate women to men. You press them on that subject, and they will say Judeo-Christian values for the first 15 minutes, and 15 minutes after that, they will be talking about how supper should be ready on the table when they get home from work. But naturally, a sentiment like that prompted Susan Jacoby to write a wonderful piece and say, no, that isn't true, that's a delusion. And that's always been a delusion, so let's not even go down that road. That was very nice, but it's in the pile on the floor now with a baby bean on top of it. But anyway, that was my Tedium Fest, to match David Murphy's Tedium Fest. And you can tune in next week when I assume he will go through the Wall Street Journal again and I will go through the New York Times again. Doesn't that sound like fun? Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up for now. We have books to talk about, so I will be back. Thank you, BookTube.